Hey, Dr. Wood. So today I'll be talking about just the army and in Egypt and its like secular just quality and how it's existed over time. And I think we'd start with just like a history. Um, so Inception, it was originally like Egypt tradition throughout history had always been kind of like unified with this date, but around like World War II that wasn't the case with like the Muslim Brotherhood controlling just parts of the army. And the special apparatus was home to some key players in Egypt history. Here you can see one of them. That's Anwar al-Sadat. And Nasser was also involved in well. But eventually they turned in like from the Brotherhood officers to the Freedom officers. And then they ended up overthrowing King Farouk. And they were kind of, the Brotherhood and the military were tied at the moment. But then the military sort of didn't like what the Brotherhood was doing, or didn't really support them, I guess, after they had tried to assassinate Nasser, in which Nasser had like a big crackdown, thousands of people just imprisoned and leaders executed. Um, so during this time, the army was allowed to flourish, gaining lots of just political and economic traction. They weren't necessarily like the political party in charge; it was more like the regime with like Nasser and Sadat and all that. But many of Egypt's leaders would go through the military. Um, like some economical control they have. This was in 2014, but they have controls of firms, just like plots of land where they could just like lease it out to people and get lots of money. And so they ended up controlling around like I think like 2014 they had like around 40% of the economy, which is crazy. Um, so yeah, this is we'll skip many years ahead to just the ascent to power of the military because the military was more concerned about just keeping its status. It was pretty strong, getting support from the U.S. ever since around like the Gulf War in 1980s. It was getting all this support from the U.S. and eventually Egypt's military had its time to like join and get lots of political power. And after starting with the ousting Hosni Mubarak wasn't fulfilling the people's wishes, wanted to groom his son for his role, all that. Um, he wasn't any. They called up the military to go ahead and oust him, and eventually the military took over after he left. Um, they had his well, we'll mention Sisi later, but Sisi, the guy in front of Sisi's name, like Tantawi, was just the interim president, I guess, and he controlled the country for the time, or until Egypt could come up with a parliament or a democratic body, and the military let the people have their wishes and get their democratic election. And what was kind of they didn't want was Morsi and the rest of the Islamists who had been biding time in the shadows of Muslim Brotherhood, who ended up gaining lots of the seats in parliament. And there was like it was like toss up between picking like an old regime member and uh, Morsi, and they eventually that didn't fly. Morsi did not really fulfill his end of like getting Egypt to where it wanted to be because there's lots of just poverty and it just didn't work. Okay, so after Morsi had been busy just trying to Islamize or impose Islamic principles on the people in extended term, that's what he did. Um, and there was an intervention by the military because the people were just begging for it. Um, Sisi would end up getting control of the military after Tantawi, Morsi, like a little long story. Sinai Peninsula, um, there was an issue with terrorism. A bunch of head officers in the military got charged. Tantawi ended up getting ousted from office, and Sisi came to his role. And I think now it's appropriate time to touch on Sisi. Okay, so Sisi, I'd like to think many scholars think he might be a Salafist, which is weird. Um, you wouldn't really expect like a person to be too religious if they were entering politics, especially if Salafists. But I think a lot of like modern misconception that all Salafists have to be like radical Sunnis, which is simply not the case. And you can almost see that he would turn out to be a Salafist when his father, very religious, grew up near Al Azhar Mosque, all that, and you can kind of see with he doesn't have a super pro-Western like. He only interacts with them because they just give him stuff, I guess, especially like the U.S. Economic and military aid. Um, but Sisi took over. He led the coup against Morsi, um, gains the presidency, um, and then some would go as far to say he was a reformer. Um, and Sisi, that could be argued with his support of the Coptic Christians, who after Hosni Mubarak's regime fell, got into heated sectarian conflict with the Muslims of the nation, and he applied capital punishment to Muslims for their hate crimes, which had never really been done before in the previous regimes. And another reform or something that he did as a sign of like religious tolerance. Although in the new constitution it said that religious tolerance is emblematic of Egypt, and even though it does say Islam is the state religion, but as you can see, like a state can still be secular and run by a secular operation, and still have like Islamist principles, I guess. But anyway, this is if you look right here, this is the mosque in Cairo that is emblematic of his religious tolerance, which you don't even. It could be an act of good faith, just getting the Jews just like recognition for their past, and although Egypt kind of did a good job of getting them all out of Israel, or all to Israel, or just somewhere else in the Middle East, because it's been rough. And then if we'll go on to foreign policy, his relations to the U.S. Here's him shaking with Trump. So obviously we have kind of good relations. We get a lot of economic and military aid, especially. I was reading that um, they do gain from a study from the Department of Government um, that they do get. They do get like 10% less like import duties if they're trading with Israel to promote just like Semitism or just like pro-Semitic feelings. And if we're talking about Israel, like they've traditionally been like the mediator between these two parties, but they do have like a little bit like Hamas is a bit of an issue because they are kind of a branch of like the Muslim Brotherhood, and they embody Islamist principles, and they're more of like they kind of have to be friends because of the border, but they've been working on just filling up tunnels, um, smuggling guns, and other things. But they're they're more of like a neutral party. They're not super good friends with either country, and most Egyptians don't even want to be like in contact with the Israelis. And then if we go in the Arab world, they are recognized. They don't really weigh into the sectarian conflict. They are on good terms with Iran, such as when um, Iran made its first minister in 30 years to Egypt after the fall of like Mubarak, which has been just a testament. They have better relations, but they've chosen to stay relatively neutral in the conflict. And then I already described the U.S. North Africa, tripartite states, which means like a river state. Um, they have been it's been of varying degrees of like good relations. They have been trying to keep well, from this issue has been coming on for a while with no, like North African states trying to gain more power, and Egypt's not really down with that. Nor Sudan, but they're starting to lean towards Ethiopia as they're trying to build the Grand Renaissance Dam, which will dry up Egypt, possibly, or might. That's what they suspect. But um, Egypt is of like okay relation with the North Africa and tripartite states. But they have been trying to flex colonial treaties, which aren't really flying and are kind of a poor sentiment these days. All right. Opposition and conflict. Okay, so Sisi's rule hasn't been all sunshine and roses. He's essentially prolonged his term far after it's expired. Um, being reelected twice. Reelected. His powers have been extended until 2030, and it could easily be extended longer if he's not dead by then. But um, the issue of like in September riots. Those were in September. Someone was going on social media. I can't really remember his name right now, but he was bashing Sisi and the corrupt regime, and that led to people running in the streets. And um, he dropped tear gas, lists thousands of prisoners to add to the numerous political prisoners that he's accumulated over the career because he doesn't really like dissidents, and you can definitely see this in the Muslim Brotherhood and Islamists when he made them outlawed after they attacked a police HQ and have gone to combat their terrorism, which they've done and have been surviving though, despite having to break up their hierarchical structure and being spread very thin. Um, but he hasn't allowed them to be an independent party, unlike other rulers out in Egypt's history. And um, yeah, he's not budging it. He's not giving them any ground. So he's basically solidifying his control of Egypt by solidifying his rule, even with the religious population, by controlling mosques, solidifying his rule even further by like he's getting rid of radical Islamic institutions and mosques in Egypt, which hasn't been super productive for his rule. But it has the ones that do support him, like Al Azhar, are very notable, tied to the university. Um, After that, um, he has done away with a lot of the secularist parties, forcing them to assimilate. They're not allowed to gain their own identity. So he controls most of parliament, which is going to make it very hard for the Egyptian people to seize seize the power back. But I mean, they did ask for it when they asked for the military to come in, and a lot of secularist parties. So yeah, that is my report of the army. Uh, Thank you, and have a good summer, Dr. Wood. Bye.